introduction to today's presenter, I almost feel it's not necessary to do that. Earl Schwartz is the most regular presenter that we have in our Adult Forum series, and we're absolutely delighted that it seems most years we can get him for a couple of weeks anyway, because the rave reviews keep coming, and Susan and I genuinely appreciate his willingness to be here and your responsiveness to him. But Earl Schwartz is going to lead us for this week and next, looking at Hannah and some other things. And so I will reintroduce, for those of you who haven't been here for several years, Earl Schwartz. And thanks very much for taking the time. Let me take that bell. Unless you need the bell.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's see. I so appreciate being with you. And, the invitation is always a delight for me, and I look forward to studying together once again these 2 weeks. As Dwight suggested, we are going to be studying the first 2 chapters of the book of Samuel together. And in a moment, I'll say a word about why I find those passages particularly rich in possibilities, given only a couple of weeks to focus on a given biblical text. But I want to begin this way, as I often do now with my classes in Bible at Hamline. When I was 16 or so, my closest friend, Richard's father died, leaving his mother with limited financial resources, and we were working class kids from North Minneapolis, and it was the Nixon years. It was the era of the assassination. The Vietnam War was raging. We were very draftable. And so when we graduated from high school, Richard set out in search of somewhat less dreary prospects. And he made his way eventually to Israel, the land of our ancestors. And he spent nearly a year there. He studied at what was at the time a kind of hipster rabbinical school on Mount Sinai. This was, on the one hand, a place where you could go and study classical rabbinic texts, but on the other hand, they promoted the place with a rock band that used to tour. It was a 70s sort of thing, not far from the current wall of the old city of Jerusalem, on Mount Sinai, or on that ridge today identified as Mount Sinai. And when Richard returned after nearly a year there, he gave me a prayer book. He brought back this prayer book for me that he had purchased, with a very lovely inscription in the front. And this happens to be a prayer book arranged by the disciples of a very prominent 18th century Lithuanian rabbi. So now we have a rather odd triangle, don't we? From North Minneapolis to Mount Zion to the 18th century Lithuanian Jewish community. And I soon discovered, as I thumbed through the pages, that he had pressed wildflowers in between them, here and there. And nearly 50 years later, some of them are still between the pages. Flowers that he apparently had picked one day or another while in Israel. I'm sure the day he picked them, they were supple, and they were still bright purple or yellow or green. And despite the press of the pages, when I first got the book, they were still in 3 dimensions. As I said, this is the book. Over time, some of those flowers have, I'm quite sure, fallen out. I don't know where they are. Or they've returned to the dust. Only a bit of what he put between these pages still remains. And what does remain are now flattened, faded, fragments of once whole, living flowers. Pushed against the pages in somewhat disarray. Here and there, on a page, you'll find a stain mark of a spot where a fresh flower once lay, but I don't have the flower, I just have the stain. And I say this because we're about to study a literature that is, in many ways, like those flowers. Story, poetry, and law, studied reflection, and prophecy, and lament. Words plucked one day from their field of meaning and preserved in a book. In the weeks ahead, you'll hear me use words and metaphors that I expect, I hope, will remind you of this. And when we come to the end of our study together, and we close our Bibles, perhaps you'll think of what they hold as something like the flowers inside my prayer book. And so I begin with this. The words and the world we're about to explore were once as real as this world and these words. And our first task is going to be to better grasp what we can make of that reality, and more carefully, honestly calculate what we cannot. That's what Richard's gift to me reminds me again and again, each time I open it. Think carefully about what I can still grasp of that reality, and honestly calculate what I cannot. The physical, the social, the cultural, the moral terrain of that world and those words. First broadly, and then I hope by the end of our study together in more personal terms. And in doing so, not only gain a better appreciation of those passages from the book of Samuel that we'll be studying, but a better understanding of what becomes of a world when we try to convey it through words, spoken or written. And so with that, I turn to the book of Samuel in particular. This book is initially about the man Samuel, the last of the charismatic warrior chieftains referred to in the Hebrew Bible as the Shoftim, somewhat misleadingly translated into English. Charts are closer to chieftain. The last of the divine anarchs, we might say. Those leaders of the ancient Israelites who understood that the king of Israel reigned. And that was the dawn of Israel. Then we will follow our study together, find ourselves immersed in the story of Saul, the first of the multi-tribal Israelite monarchs, and then David. And the lives of these three are entwined in the underlying theme of the whole book, which is how political power, under the peculiar covenantal circumstances of ancient Israel, how political power is gained and then transitioned among Israelites. Martin Buber emphasizes in this regard the closing narratives of the book of Judges that precedes the book of Samuel, in which divine anarchy, a system of warrior chieftains pledged to a sovereign God, devolves into a kind of criminal chaos. Buber notes that the phrase is repeated through the end of the book, "There was then no king in Israel." In fact, the end of the book of Judges itself is those words. There was then no king in Israel. Punctuating this social and political unraveling. The book of Samuel, then begins with those circumstances. But if in other political contexts, the need for a strong man in such a situation might seem obvious, King Arthur rise to the forefront, seize the opportunity to restore some degree of order on behalf of the people. If that would seem, many contexts, the obvious solution to such circumstance, in biblical history, this problem would prove a pivotal paradox, inasmuch as, of course, as I just said, there was a king in Israel, just not yet a human monarchy. The pivot for this crisis is the man Samuel. Now, in a moment, I'd like to read with you the first few verses of Samuel and talk with you about it in its social and political context as best we can reconstruct it. But before we do that, I just want to make a couple observations about things that we should keep in mind, once again, when reading any biblical text. So let me pass this up, and I hope there are almost enough copies. Once again, I would repeat Dwight's sage advice: it's always good to share the word of God. Thanks so much. What I'm passing out to you, we'll look at twice this morning. First, for its historical, critical implications, and then a little later this morning for its literary implications as well. What you have in front of you are three versions of the passage from the opening verses of the book of Samuel. I've translated all of these texts into English, but as you can see, they are originally from three other languages. One is the traditional Jewish Hebrew Masoretic text of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. The second, the middle column, is the Septuaginta, or the Septuagint, the Greek translation of a Hebrew text. We're not quite sure what exactly that text might be, but a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, of those same passages, done, roughly 200 to 300 years, let's say, before the birth of Jesus. And then an Aramaic Targum, or paraphrase of the same passage, likely derived from translation, simultaneous translation of the passage, when read in synagogues in the Second Temple period, or shortly after the end of the Second Temple period, for the benefit of Jews in the synagogue who didn't understand Hebrew or Greek, but did speak Aramaic. So you have the same text in those three versions in front of you. One would assume that the Masoretic text is basically the oldest, the Septuagint, a translation that in its translated form is the next oldest, and then the Targum. As I said a moment ago, you can't be sure of exactly the relationship between these three. And on the face of it, if you were simply to skim these three versions of this section from the opening passage of Samuel, they look reasonably the same. Right below the English translation, you have the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Aramaic. And then underneath the middle column, you have an apparatus. And I just want to say a word about the apparatus for now. Not only do those three columns already suggest that when one uses the definite article, the Bible, to speak of a biblical text, you're already stretching. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that makes a difference in just a moment. But not only is that the case, but that apparatus at the bottom of the page tells us that today there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of variant texts that vary one from another, very minor differences to sometimes quite significant differences. All of those texts are available in manuscript form, or once were available in manuscript form, and they differ. The study of the little differences is often referred to as text criticism, or once upon a time it was referred to as the lower criticism. The study of the bigger differences and their larger social and political implications commonly was referred to at one point as higher criticism. In either case, and we'll be talking about both of these concerns, in either case, at the very least, to know that this is the ground we're standing on, and it's already problematic in terms of just tell me what the text says, it deserves our careful attention. It simply means we have to be somewhat modest, somewhat humble about assumptions regarding what it is we're reading. This whole page, in summary, says this. The top is the translation. The middle are three different versions, each of which have to be translated into the top. The bottom tells you that in doing those translations, there have been, for thousands of years, disagreements about what exactly the wording is, and that's just the beginning. That deserves careful consideration and some degree of modesty, especially about assumptions. Now, I just want to point out, some people say, why do they pick on the Bible that way? Boy, it's this plot to undermine the authority of Scripture. I wish it were so simple, but I'm afraid it's not. It's in the nature of text. And I just want to give you an example that should, make us feel a little bit better about historical criticism of biblical text, or maybe a little bit more wary of the text in general, but one that comes closer to home. If you turn over the page, let me digress for a moment. About 5 years ago, I had a marvelous opportunity to participate in a conference sponsored by an organization that used to be have its home at Hamline, called the Journal of Law and Religion. And every year, the journal would sponsor a national conference. And in 2012, the theme of the conference was the letter from Birmingham jail and its implications for law and people of faith. And in preparing for that conference, I was given the task of doing, interestingly enough, what had never been done before, which was to prepare an annotated critical edition of Letter from Birmingham Jail. This was an extraordinary experience, and among other things, I have the Marty family to thank for part of what made this work possible. Dr. Marty, with Joel Marty's help, arranged for me to get in contact with one of the copy editors of the version of Letter from Birmingham Jail that appeared in Christian Century in June of 1963. That version of the letter ultimately became the version that was the basis of almost all other versions that followed. But this fellow, whose name was Dean Pierman, made it clear to me that the version that came out of Christian Century wasn't the version that came in. And his correspondence was extremely valuable. Now, as you can see, What you have here in front of you is the opening of the letter. I want to say that the letter from Birmingham jail justly occupies a position, classic text in the story of the United States in the 20th century. A text of extreme power and influence, of importance. A text that one could call a text of faith for Americans of that time and this time. But the truth is, a letter from Birmingham jail was written and rewritten numerous times before the final version appeared some 7 or 8 months later in book form. And there were some lower critical changes along the way. Change of an article from definite to indefinite, a little bit of spelling correction, a little bit of rewording. But there were also significant changes. And as you can see, my notes on the right-hand column document those changes in this opening passage. Let me just point out a couple of them that I think are particularly significant. First is, the letter from Birmingham jail in its earliest versions included the names of the particular ministers and rabbi who had taken out an ad in the Birmingham newspapers that Dr. King read while in solitary confinement in Birmingham jail. The newspaper was smuggled into him. He read the ad, and the letter was originally addressed to those figures. First time those names were dropped was in the Christian Century version of the letter, and Dean Pierman gave me the correspondence between Christian Century and Dr. King, documenting the change. The change was simply this. 2 months after the incident, Christian Century said, "We have a feeling that this letter is going to be historic, and that its implications go far beyond those small number of ministers to whom it was originally addressed. We recommend that when we reprint the letter, we drop the names." And so they were dropped from the beginning of the letter. Let me just point out one more difference. Anything in brackets in the text appears in the earliest versions of the letter we have. Anything underlined appears only in the later versions. One significant change, but it's important though small, is this. As you can see in the opening passage, "My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling," as you can see, in the original text that we have, the earliest text, Dr. King wrote, "our." In the final version, "our" was changed to "my present activities." Now, for our purposes, why that change was inserted isn't all that important. I only put it before you today because this document is only 50-some years old. It's justly powerful, significant, it has ongoing influence, it's important to our story collectively. But isn't that intriguing? That within a few months after the letter was originally put together, it was considered valuable enough a change to alter the text from "our activities" to "my activities." And the change then permeates the balance of the text. Several other places, the plural is replaced by the singular "I" or "my" or "mine." Well, I only note that to say, as I said a moment ago, that historical criticism often seems just a kind of dusty, obscure, maybe ill-willed approach to studying the Bible. Unfortunately, we've got no choice. That's the way books are. And one has to assume that it was a matter of providence, that if these important words were to be committed in writing, we understood from the beginning what liability comes with words on a page. Yes?
What is the form of the original letter? What materials? And where is it now?
This is also scriptural. I'm glad you asked. The booklet that we put out for this conference has a critical introduction. Dr. King famously wrote the first version of the letter on toilet paper and the margins of the newspaper that had the ad that he was responding to, because he was in solitary confinement. And everything that he used to write the letter had to be smuggled in. Eventually, he arranged to get paper, but originally it was written on scraps of this and that. The testimony is that those fragments, smuggled out piece by piece from the jail cell, were brought to the office that was organizing the Birmingham campaign, immediately typed. Dr. King's handwriting wasn't all that legible, so it had to be interpreted as it was being typed. And those original scraps, thrown away. So the very first text, we don't have.
Just like the Bible.
Yes, that's right. Those original scraps thrown away. It was published several times leading up to the version that appeared in Christian Center. And those earlier versions in magazines and as mailings to supporters of the movement differed. Sometimes significant.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Back to Sam. Yes, please. Did you?
You've talked before how so much of this in the early days was oral tradition.
Absolutely.
So doesn't that complicate this much further?
Absolutely it does. It does. It certainly does. And as we'll see in just a moment, when we talk about the literary character of the text, the fact that this was written text dictated from an oral tradition makes it all the more complicated. Great observation. Yep. Good. Yes, please.
I was just going to say, with the Gettysburg Address, I think it's a beautiful example. Lincoln wrote, say, people sitting there, reporters,
Right.
took notes on it, printed it in a Chicago paper and
Yes.
so forth like that. It didn't very different. He made a whole bunch of copies for friends who asked him for copies.
Yes.
And he made changes.
Absolutely.
And it bugs me the way I memorized it. Yes, I still remember it. And he had the gall to change it.
I have a book, 4 versions of Gettysburg Address. Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. Right, thank you. Thank you. Having said that, do caution, let's look at those opening verses from 1 Samuel. As I said, if we follow the biblical historiographic arc, we would have just completed the book of Judges, ending with, in those days, there was no king in Israel. First Samuel, verses 1 through 8. Now, I'll read these verses now just from the Hebrew. I'll translate it as I read it. And please follow. These are New Revised Standards.
About 3 versions.
I
International, I in Jerusalem, and just for this kind of reason.
Wonderful, wonderful translation. The variation in translations can only be helpful. Here's what I see. There happened to be a certain man from Matayim Sophie, from the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, the son of Yeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Suf, from Ephrath. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the second, or the same name of the other, was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man would go up from his town from time to time to worship and sacrifice God of the armies, or God of the hosts, or God of the hordes. The word Tsebaot just means this big group. It's sometimes used to describe the stars in the sky, the hosts of heaven. This obscure term, which later becomes relatively common liturgically, Lord of hosts, but whose roots are not clear at all, to worship God at Shiloh. And there were the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Pinchas, priests to God. And the day would come, and Elkanah would sacrifice, and he would give to Peninnah his wife, and all of her children, sons and daughters, portions. And to Hannah he would give a double portion, because he loved Hannah. And though, but, nevertheless, however, God had closed her womb, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Her rival would anger her so, because of her barrenness, because God had closed her womb. That's what would happen year after year when they would go up to the house of God. So she would anger her, and she would cry, and she wouldn't eat. And Elkanah said to her husband, Hannah, why are you crying? Why aren't you eating? Why are you so dispirited? Aren't I better to you than 10 sons?
Or Elkanah.
So we'll come back to that last line in just a minute. But I'd like to go through the text first of all to glean what we can of a kind of social base for what we've just read. That is to say, thinking of my friend Richard's flowers from the hillsides of Jerusalem 50 years ago, let's see what we can gather just from that text about the natural environment in which this narrative occurred. Something about the field of meaning, one might say, from which these words were plucked. Let's just look at those first 2 verses in this regard to begin. So here's how I would read them again. There came, or there happened to be, a certain man from Ramathaim Sophim, from the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, son of Yeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Suf, of Ephrat. And he had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, the name of the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children. Hannah had no children. Now, if you read those 2 verses in sequence, you might miss what becomes apparent if you put them side by side. So imagine those first 2 verses, not as one after another, but parallel. What's the difference between the way in which Elkanah is introduced and the way in which Peninnah and Hannah are introduced? How do you identify Elkanah the man?
He's identified by his ancestors.
His ancestors.
Father.
Yes. And the repeated term that anchors that opening verse, and as you can see on the sheet that you received about key things to keep in mind in reading Bible, repeated words because of the oral roots of biblical tradition, as we previously discussed this, are almost certainly thematically significant. What's the repeated word in verse 1? Son of, yes. You could give his lineage without repeating the word son of. But in the Hebrew, it's unmistakable. Son of, son of, son of, son of. And if you put the verse introducing Hannah and Peninnah next to that verse, how is her identity established? On the one hand, they're wives, and on the other, children. It's the same lead word. It's the same term, son of, son of, son of. In the Hebrew, it's children. She has children. She doesn't have children. But what's the difference? What's the existential difference between saying a man's identity is secured by his lineage, a woman's identity is secured by her children? What's the existential difference?
Value. The value. The woman has no value because of her lack of children, or has value because of she does have children.
It's true. You might have less value if you have less valuable lineage. It's also possible that we're led to believe that knowing Elkanah's ancestry gives us a sense of his significance. But there's also a deeper existential difference, a basic, fundamental difference between saying your identity is secured by where you came from. Her identity is secured by who comes from her. What's the difference, existentially speaking? What does that second verse point out about the difference between saying a man is who he is, first of all, because he has ancestry. A woman can be who she can be. What's the next word?
It's an if.
If, right? If she has children. Here's the fundamental existential difference. Everyone's going to have lineage. We all come from somewhere. If a male's identity is established by ancestry, they have an identity. It might not be as lofty an identity. It might not be in social terms as valuable an identity. But you come from somewhere. It's striking that these two women aren't introduced by a done deal. There's nothing secure about who they are. It's all contingent. It's all conditional. Elkanah's identity is safe because it's over. These two women represent a different existential condition. Makes sense? Okay. Now this man would go from time to time, literally in the Hebrew, from day to day, from his town, to worship and sacrifice to God at Shiloh. And there were the two sons, there's the word again, of Eli, Hophni and Pinchas, priests to God. When they're there, on those days when he would sacrifice, he would give to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters, portions. And to Hannah, he would give, and as you can see, if we go back now to the 3-column text, it's not clear. And I mention this now because almost certainly what you have as a difference between the Masoretic text and what a Greek translator thought the text must mean, almost certainly evidence of a social prejudice. The translation here is being driven by certain assumptions. Let me just say that the conjunction that precedes the last clause in verse 5, and to Hannah he would give a double portion because he loved Hannah. The next word in the Hebrew, that conjunction, is simply the. Now, most commonly, the default translation for the into English is and. And as I said when I translated this for you a moment ago, and in Hebrew can, in biblical Hebrew, cover though, nevertheless, so, although, however, and. All of those possibilities in that one term. The Septuagint translator seems to have decided that the only way this verse makes sense is to read it this way. To Hannah, he gave a single portion because she had no child. Even so, Elkanah loved Hannah more, though God had closed her womb. The Hebrew for a double is in fact one twice. That's how you say Hebrew, double in the Bible. It's one way you can say it, one twice. The Septuagint translator couldn't believe it. As you can see, either the translator couldn't believe it, or the translator was working from a Hebrew text that had already read differently. In either case, as you can see, the Septuagint follows a rather conventional line. To Hannah, he must have given a single portion because she had no child. That's the social logic of the circumstances. No child, unproductive as a wife, only gets one portion. Even so, he loved her nevertheless, though God had closed her womb. As you can see, in the Masoretic Hebrew text, it's all much more obscure, much richer in possibilities. In the Hebrew, as best I can translate it, it simply reads, and to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved Hannah, and then the text says, you tell me. Though, however, even though, nevertheless, but, and. That obscure conjunction leaves the listener wondering. And as we mentioned a moment ago, and as I point out, in the 6 things to keep in mind when reading a Hebrew Bible text, premises underlying this written text are all based on the nature of oral communication. We assume that these narratives were spoken long before they were ever written down. And that the first step in taking those plucked flowers out of their natural environment and putting them in the pages of a book was to deprive us of that oral moment when the narrator could say, and to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved Hannah. Even though God had closed her womb. A nod of the head, a change in the tone of the voice, a gesture, a movement, all lost. That part of the field of meaning has been constricted down to the words on the page. Nevertheless, the fact that the Hebrew text seems the most vague, in fact, likely reflects the most authentic point of origin for the written text, which is, in an oral moment, there's no need sometimes to go beyond a gesture. Yes, yes, please.
Does biblical Hebrew have conjunctions that have that variation of meaning?
There are other terms that could be used that could be clearer. That's right.
So in a sense, it might be very intentional to
choose the least clear term. Yes, that's right. Exactly.
What was the Hebrew term?
The,
Not key.
no, key is the term, thank you. So, here's the Hebrew. Ulachana yitain mana achat apayim, ki et Chana ahav. Because, there it's clear, because he loved Hannah. V'Adonai sagaro ma, and God closed it. So the reason he gives her the double portion is clear, because he loved her. The connection between that and having God close her womb, that's where the conjunction is on. Yes?
The verb in the Septuagint is from agape. The verb that's so important for Christians.
Yes, agapa. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me say a word. I'm glad you said that. Let me say a word about agape in Septuagint Hebrew. Septuagint Greek. It became important in the development of Christian doctrine over time to employ that Greek term, agape, in specific doctrinal ways to describe an orientation toward another that had something to do with the full realization of Christian community. But in the Septuagint, it's used much, much more broadly. It can signify a full range of relationships, including relationships diametrically opposed to the agape love that emerges in Christian community. So it's a vaguer term in the Greek too. Okay. With that in mind, the fact that we're looking at a text which can be very open is rooted in this highly charged gender distinction. What follows is all the more dramatic. Let's finish those first 8 verses with a more careful reading. To Hannah he gave a double portion, because Hannah he loved. And though, however, nevertheless, God closed her. Her rival angered her so because of her barrenness, because God closed her womb. And there, because is used rather than that more obscure term when connected with what it was about her relationship with her husband. Verse 7. This would happen every year when they went up to the house of God. So she would anger her, and she would cry, and she wouldn't eat. The next story is a story of confession. Next verse. Confession in this regard. Throughout all of my youth, I thought the next verse was about what a good guy that was. Fine man he was. What a loving husband. Until one day a teacher of mine offered an alternative. And ever since, it's made me much more careful about my reading. So let's read verse 8 carefully. Then her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why are you crying? Why won't you eat? Why are you so dispirited? Aren't I better to you than 10 sons? Aren't I better to you than 10 sons? In my wayward youth, I thought, what a heroic husband. Until my teacher said, what do you think he said? And what did he actually say? So, what do you think I used to hear him say, as opposed to what the words actually say that he said? He said, Hannah, why are you so unhappy? I matter to you more than 10 sons. How in my youth did I hear Elkanah as a young man listening to another man assuming the best about what he was saying to a dispirited woman? What did I think I heard? Hannah, aren't you
Grateful? Grateful?
That's what he is saying.
You're really fortunate.
And once my teacher said, don't you hear what he's saying, which is, aren't you grateful? What did you think he said? So, here's what I grew up thinking when he said, Hannah, why are you so sad? Aren't you?
You are really fortunate to have me.
That's what he does say. What did I used to think he said? Aren't you Are you grateful?
Lucky.
That's what he does say. Aren't you grateful?
Lucky.
That's no great shakes. A man who says, aren't you grateful? That's just a man. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
What did I think he said? Aren't you more to me? My teacher, I will forever be thankful. He said, what did you think he said? And look again at what he said. What Elkanah says is, Kana, I am so good to you. Aren't you grateful? Don't you realize I'm better to you than those 10 sons? It's all about me. This story is actually, Kana, about how good a guy I am. So why are you depressing us all by refusing to join? That's what he's saying.
Get over it.
Get over it. What I imagined he said was, you mean more to you than all of that. But he doesn't. And here's why that's important. Because of verse 9. And Hannah got up after they ate in Shiloh and after they drank. And Eli, the priest, was sitting on his chair at the doorway to the hall of God. She was embittered, and she prayed to God, and she cried on and on. This is a classical example of what I described in the first paragraph of 6 things to keep in mind when reading a Hebrew Bible text as condensation. As I say, biblical narratives are most often condensed stories. This means they tend to be very terse, employing a minimum of words. Biblical narratives often note the passage of long stretches of time without commenting on intervening events. It's also quite common for narratives to relate crucial developments in a story without providing the reader with descriptions of corresponding thoughts or motives or feelings of the character. These spaces invite the active participation of the reader in the unfolding of the story. Eli makes this typical gender charge. Look, I'm treating you too good for you to go around pouting. The very next verse isn't, and she said to him, why don't you grow up? Or she said, what are you talking about? Or she said to him, don't you understand? Well, that's not the way a biblical text would tend to tell the story. Instead, you have the abrupt, she gets up and violates the authority of the high priest to take her case to God. Pregnant question, if you will allow me to use the metaphor, is what's the relationship between the end of verse 8 and the beginning of verse 9? Yes.
I lived in a household in Africa
Yes.
with a Muslim imam, and he had 3 wives.
Yes.
And the middle wife was barren. And the youngest wife, who was 18 and had a child, treated this middle wife with absolute contempt. And every time, not every time, but oftentimes, when the younger wife would talk to the middle wife, she would pick her baby up and talk to her.
The pain that can emerge under these circumstances is enormous, profound, especially if your identity depends entirely on this absence. Absolutely. I think what you have in the space between the end of verse 8 and the beginning of verse 9 is this. A moment when a biblical character articulates utter frustration with circumstance because of Elkanah's inability to understand her pain, and now the quintessential biblical Israelite moment ensues. This is a person who has no past, This is a person who's dependent entirely on what could yet be. She finds herself trapped in relationships that are oppressive of her potential. And in the end, a husband who thinks that she is ungrateful is the trigger for launching one of the boldest, one of the bravest, historiographically pivotal moments in biblical history. She's had enough, and she makes her own choice. Her choice is to take her case to God.
And again, it says, it was God who made her parent.
Absolutely.
And why isn't she mad at God?
Absolutely. It's a great question. It's a great question, and we'll see. We'll see. It's a wonderful question. The irony behind the possibility that God is complicit in her suffering informs the whole narrative. Absolutely. Thank you. We'll come back to it. Yes.
Why did you say that she ignored the right of the high priest? Something about that she...
What I'm going to suggest next week is that what we have in common is a paradigmatic Israelite type. The Israelites imagined themselves as people without a lineage, people without all of the claims to conventional authority that their neighbors might have. They gave up their citizenship, if they ever had it, in their homeland. They were vulnerable, easily oppressed, and preyed upon. Their only hope ultimately was a covenant that was to be realized in what could yet be. But it required that they violate the conventions of their time and place, that they allow their God to demonstrate a kind of authority that was disruptive and ultimately showed disdain for conventional power relationships and authority, beginning with the Exodus from Egypt, which is all about not simply liberating the Israelites, but liberating them in a way that trespasses on the rightful turf of local powers, divine and human. That's why the Exodus takes place the way it does. We have that all in this woman. A woman entirely dependent on a possibility of what could yet be. Violates convention for the sake of that hope. And we'll see, as her story continues to unfold, the degree to which Hannah is, in this narrative, as paradigmatic an Israelite as Abraham or Jacob. We'll leave the story. Thank you.